Welcome to Essentials, where we explore the big issues shaping our world. I'm Carver Benson. In today's episode, we dive into the major trends that will define the next 20 years. From demographic changes and urbanization to economic and technological challenges, we'll connect the dots to understand how these forces will affect societies and why the future may be harder than we think.
Hi, I'm Carly Jensen. Indeed, today we're tackling the trends shaping the future, and let's be honest, this episode of Essentials might be quite scary.
Indeed. You might think after watching this episode that the world is a big mess we cannot solve.
Well, it will be tough to solve, but we need to set the first step. Become aware of what is coming our way. Only then can we start preparing ourselves and maybe even start thinking about possible solutions.
Okay, but let's not speculate. Let's stick to the hard facts.
Carver, let's kick off with demographics. These are easiest to predict.
Sure, Carly. By 2040, the global population is projected to reach 9.2 billion, but not all regions are growing equally. Europe's population is shrinking and aging rapidly. For example, Italy's median age will surpass 50 by 2040, with nearly one-third of Italians over 65.
Meanwhile, sub-Saharan Africa is booming. Nigeria alone will add almost 200 million people, becoming the third most populous country in the world after India and China. Its working-age population will double, creating enormous potential if those workers can find jobs.
And that's the big issue. Cities like Lagos and Kinshasa are growing by tens of thousands of people each week, but basic infrastructure can't keep up. In Lagos, nearly 60% of residents live in informal settlements with limited access to clean water or electricity.
It's not just infrastructure, it's education too. In sub-Saharan Africa, 40% of children are out of secondary school. Without significant investment, this youth surge risks becoming a massive underutilized resource, fueling migration instead of local development.
That brings us to migration. Rising populations in Africa and the Middle East are driving people to seek opportunities abroad, especially in Europe. In 2022, over 330,000 migrants crossed the Mediterranean, with many coming from Nigeria, Sudan, and Afghanistan.
Europe's need for migrants is real. Germany, for instance, will face a labor shortfall of 5 million workers by 2040. Healthcare alone needs hundreds of thousands of nurses and caregivers to support its aging population.
But migration is fraught with challenges. Many migrants arrive without the skills needed for high-demand jobs. For instance, only 15% of Syrian refugees in Germany were employed after their first 5 years in the country.
And host communities face pressures too. In Italy, anti-migrant sentiment surged after the arrival of over 100,000 migrants in 2023, leading to political instability and protests. It's a complex dynamic. Europe needs these workers, but integration policies haven't kept pace.
Let's talk about polarization. Across the globe, societies are becoming more divided by income, ideology, and identity.
In the US, for example, political polarization has reached record levels. In 2020, 77% of Democrats and 76% of Republicans said they couldn't agree on basic facts. This division slows progress on issues like climate change, immigration, and healthcare.
And it's not just the US. In Brazil, polarization fueled massive protests during recent elections, deepening distrust in institutions. This lack of cohesion makes long-term problem-solving nearly impossible.
Internationally, it's the same story. For instance, despite universal recognition of climate change, countries like the US and China are locked in economic and geopolitical competition, hindering cooperation on emissions reduction.
Another hurdle is economic stagnation. Governments have relied heavily on debt to fund growth and social programs, but many are reaching their limits. Japan's debt is already over 250% of GDP, and the US recently surpassed 31 trillion in national debt.
This leaves little room for new investments in critical areas like infrastructure or education. For instance, in sub-Saharan Africa, an estimated $93 billion per year is needed to close infrastructure gaps. But governments can't meet these needs without external funding.
And in middle-income countries like South Africa, rising inequality adds another layer. In Johannesburg, 80% of economic activity is concentrated in wealthier neighborhoods, while informal settlements see little development. This middle-income trap is becoming harder to escape.
Let's turn to technology. Artificial intelligence and renewable energy are making headlines, but their benefits aren't evenly distributed. For example, while countries like Norway are already 98% powered by renewables, many African nations still rely on coal and oil.
And then there's automation. In India, a study found that 40% of jobs in manufacturing could be automated by 2035. While this boosts efficiency, it leaves millions of workers at risk of displacement, especially in low-skill sectors.
Climate change is another looming challenge. The IPCC estimates that by 2040, over 100 million people in Africa could be displaced by rising sea levels and extreme weather events. In places like Bangladesh, entire coastal communities are already being forced to migrate.
So, where does this leave us? The next 20 years are likely to bring more division and tension. Polarization within societies and between nations makes addressing global challenges harder.
Well, I think I need a drink after this episode. It seems all very depressing.
I agree. This is a tough message, but it is better to know and be prepared.
Yep, otherwise it will hit us even harder. These are existing trends, not speculation by a fortune teller.
So, Carly, do you have already some first thoughts on potential solutions?
Well, there are pathways forward. Investing in education, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, can empower a new generation to contribute to local economies and reduce migration pressures.
And international cooperation, while difficult, is essential. For example, renewable energy partnerships between Europe and North Africa could create jobs while advancing global climate goals.
Technology, too, can be a force for good if deployed equitably. Innovations in AI, healthcare, and sustainable agriculture could transform lives if their benefits reach the people who need them most.
The stakes are high, but understanding these trends is the first step toward building a more sustainable and equitable future.
Yes, but this doesn't sound like the agenda of our current populistic leaders. This is not about building walls, increasing tariffs, or deporting millions of immigrants.
Oh, now I need a drink as well.
Thanks for joining us today. The next 20 years will be challenging, but with thoughtful action, I'm sure we can navigate what's ahead.
See you next time on Essentials, if you still dare to watch.
Bye.